For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and socially. In the midst of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other than human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationship to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, and welcome to the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. This podcast is produced and made possible from supporters on Patreon. Thank you. If the Rewilding podcast inspires you, gives you hope, or makes you think, please subscribe, share it on social media, and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. For regular listeners to the podcast and those entrenched in the rewilding movement, we know that rewilding looks different in various places and has different meanings, sometimes often leading to conflict. While human anarchic rewilding has been around just as long as conservation rewilding, they often seem to be at odds, especially when it comes to the support of state institutions, which is no surprise. Oftentimes, conservation efforts are state-sponsored, leading to displacement of people in the name of resource conservation, rather than creating regenerative systems of land management. States have it in their best interest to control food production, and conservation falls under this form of management. It's not liberatory, nor is it a long-term solution to an economy based on extraction. Human rewilding, in contrast, is considered a radical approach that aims to connect people to their place through direct land management and subsistence practices. This circumvents state power, pitting people against the institutions that aim to control everyone. In order to gain more resources from the current power structures, rewilders must often walk a fine line between what is acceptable and what we can get away with. In the end, it seems like we may be making too much headway in creating an alternative way of life, the state will take away whatever resources it has lent us. One organization I see facing this dilemma at the moment is the Rewild Project, a nonprofit focused on environmental education and ecological restoration based in the United Kingdom. Their mission is to reconnect people to nature and ancestral heritage through arts and crafts, growing food, outdoor learning, and community building projects. To talk with me about their programs and the challenges they have faced and are currently facing is their director, Scott Baine. Scott has led a life of eco-defense activism, nature connection, traveling the world learning survival skills, and community organizing around rewilding and rewilding-related concepts. He returned to the UK to study land tending practices of permaculture and regenerative agroforestry, with the aim to create edible forest gardens. Scott is passionate about rewilding people, not just the landscape. Scott, welcome to the Rewilding podcast.
Yes, thank you. I've been looking forward to this. We've been trying to sort this out for a while.
We have, yeah.
You've got a lot of interesting people on your podcast, and I love listening to it.
Awesome.
It's amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, let's start by just kind of talking about what the Rewild Project is. Like, when did it form? Were you the founder, or was there a group of people? And what are the kinds of things that you've been doing?
So we started about 7 years ago, and I guess I'd already been traveling for probably 15, 20 years. And I suppose the biggest impression was I was living in Canada and BC for about 4.5 years. And I was mostly traveling and living outside for most of it, and learned some interesting skills, met some interesting people. But also then I came back to the UK and just realizing how tiny the UK is, and then going there. And then I think I was up in Scotland on a protest site in a tree house, and met some Swedish dudes who came over. I think you know some of them actually. You studied the Stone Age Living program with links with Nick.
Mm-hmm.
And
Niklas, yeah, cool.
Yeah, some of that
That's
crew.
awesome.
So I started. They invited us over to Sweden, and then basically I ended up staying there for like 4 years as well. And then we were organising pretty much sort of wilderness gatherings each year on squatted sort of nature reserves, with the intention of sort of nature connection, but in a sense of a sort of a narco primitive back there. That back then, that's what it was called now. Mm-hmm. Sort of. And I try and make that distinct difference between, anarcho ancestral. It doesn't
Hmm.
rhyme as well, And then
Hmm.
I got into John Zerzan and Jensen and the Green Anarchy magazine and all the other like great stuff that was coming out at that time, which was kind of unheard of as well. And you were at the forefront as well, which was like really great to see. And so I was sort of gobbling all that up and then realizing, that with a bit like yourself, really, after reading Ishmael, it was just a bit like, whoa, we're like, we've got to do something. What I've got to do something like what we're going to do. So we naively thought we could live as a clan in the Swedish woods year round.
That's awesome.
And then, only people that have done it, I think, realize like, how much we've kind of forgot and how much there's actually to learn, especially if you wanted to do it as sort of authentic as possible and be a purist. But we learn a lot. You learn a lot when you're doing that kind of living. And it was brilliant, but it was also like uncomfortable and torturous. But that's how it goes. And you soon learn the pitfalls. But I think after that as well, I think I returned back to the UK again and moved over to Wales because I thought there was going to be like a gathering at a eco village which was quite new called Lamats, and there was a gathering called Plan B. And it was basically about taking land en masse without permission because it got to this point where it was just like, we can't get access to land and it's not affordable or whatever reason it is. So I was like, wow, it's happening. So I basically left Sweden and moved to Wales. And then it wasn't really happening. But then I joined a housing co-op on a farm. And these bad hippies basically took over, really corrupt. And we got evicted, so I went to court for 3 days. So and my background as well is sort of squatting, and I've always sort of been on the edge of this sort of, I guess, alternative scene. Although it seems quite natural to be able to sort of try and house yourself like affordably and live out the streets and this however you can survive. So it was interesting. I think I managed to go to university as well as a mature student, even though I didn't really have the qualifications. But I used to work in America on obese kid camps, or like as a kid we'd call them fat camps. And then I used to coach soccer as well in America. So I've traveled a lot of America as well as Canada, but then Canada was a much more sort of nature based, and I discovered that was my calling, really, was to sort of connect with nature. But then I think you get to a certain point where you need to share what it's like the time and the lone wolf's over kind of. I think the first time I heard that when I was in Canada was the Hopi prophecy, the 11th hour, and it was just like, wow, like that's like blew me away really. I was hanging out in Nelson, BC as well with a lot of sort of tripped out hippies and hanging around generally around BC. But I traveled a lot of Canada generally, sort of train hopping and cycle touring and hitchhiking and canoeing and hiking and doing wilderness and just kind of pushing it as much as I could, really. So it was quite a shock to come back to Britain, and I kind of ended up, after being evicted from that Welsh farm, the housing co-op that kind of disbanded, I ended up moving back into my van into the centre of Bristol and got involved with a growing project and ran a project sort of like with no funding, and basically I planted a forest garden at this farm at the housing co-op. I mean, that's a whole story in itself, because the guy that was the guy that was part of that kind of that farm was one of the I don't know, people talk about controlled opposition, but he was the guy that set up XR basically. So there's people sort of hold him into great esteem, but it's just like, oh, you just get to see, when you really live with these sort of people, you realize that just because it's eco and there's still a lot of like corrupt people out there. And you're like, oh, he's so naive. I thought everyone was like trying to save the planet. So anyway, so after that, Bristol, I got involved with setting up a forest garden, and that ended up in, I don't know why, wherever I go, it just seems to always end up in some sort of land occupation or eviction or some sort of conflict with the state. So it kicked off there as well because we lost some land to some nonsense greenwash, funding from Europe to this metro bus called Metro Bust. We called it, to save like 2 minutes on a bus journey, and they took acres and acres of, grade A agricultural soil, which is about 3% left of it in Britain, which is like the bestest soil, called it's kind of marked as blue on maps. There's a little finger of blue on the maps that go into Bristol, which was kind of the breadbasket for the city. And they basically just covered it in concrete to put some buses on there to basically, just greenwash tastic, really. And so that kicked off. But the forest garden that he planted at the farm that we got evicted from, I dug it up and then replanted it at this community project. That was great. That was interesting. So then after that, I basically kind of got my ex-partner accidentally pregnant on some random fling on the night that Margaret Thatcher died. It was a big celebration because my dad was a coal miner as well.
Oh, yeah.
It was always just like, he was in the strikes in Nottingham, and it was this big thing, that like, the first Saturday after Thatcher dies, come to Trafalgar Square in London and bring a bottle and let's celebrate. But I was in Bristol, but I was at the sort of anarchist pubs in Bristol in Easton, at the Chelsea and at the Plough, and basically everyone was having a nice time partying, and then the riot police turned up and it all kicked off, and that was made it interesting. And then I basically ended up conceiving my son. And my ex-partner lived in the Forest of Dean, so I ended up moving to Forest of Dean because she was on the traveller's site as well. And then we basically had my son in a year in some nice woods in Wales, and that went really well. And then basically we set up the Rewild Project because there was nothing in the Forest of Dean, like nothing. And, Forest of Dean sort of held as this like really wild, amazing nature place, but it's very sort of geared towards tourism, and there's no real environmental education. And we were like, wow, what a great opportunity. I had studied tanning as well in Sweden. So I went to Beckedal folk school and sort of intensely studied skin work. And I'd picked up a few of the sort of ancestral skills off a few of the teaching drum crew that I hung out with the Wild Growing Collective around sort of Järna and Stockholm. So I had a bit of sort of know-how, and I also was kind of involved in quite a few sort of squats and actions, and all geared towards sort of social change. So I just thought it made sense really to set up a environmental education project, and there was this kind of funding pot around for 5 years, and a bit like it's interesting with funding because I always say they're a bit like meteors that they come out of outer space. They seem massive, and as they go through the layers and layers and layers, and by the time they hit the ground, it's like a grain of sand.
Right.
All these project managers and administration, and all this nonsense take like the lion's share of the funding, and you're like, oh, okay, great. So we basically had a contract for 5 years to deliver 8 workshops in heritage craft skills and 8 workshops in edible forest skills. And then we joined in with another CIC, another social enterprise, sort of community interest company, non-for-profit. And we ran the forestry side as well. So we were doing sort of regenerative forestry practices, coppicing, because there was no coppicing going on as well in the Forest of Dean. And this all kind of ties into, this funding was tied under the Forestry England, which used to be known as the Forestry Commission. So essentially they're DEFRA, which is Department for Rural Agriculture, Environmental Department. And they are, quite a big establishment that sort of started off with, I think it was like the 1930s, to try and promote more wood tree planting. And essentially they're a public body, but they act as though they're sort of above the law, really. So so we basically sort of danced with the devil, sort of getting the funding off of them, and then they allowed us to have these sheds that we're going to knock down, basically in the middle of the woods. And
this is all in the Forest of Dean still?
Yeah, in the Forest of Dean. So these sheds, we were just like, oh, don't knock it down. We can refurb it, eco refurb it. we can turn it into a community craft center and a social forestry base.
Mm.
And they were like, okay, but there were just so many rules and nonsense. Like you
Mm-hmm.
couldn't catch water because you get Legionnaire's disease. You like they said that we couldn't have compost toilets because they're not allowed on any Forestry England
Mm-hmm.
land. They charge us like £4,000 of our funding to bury uh, a sewage tank because we had to have it all plumbed in.
Mm.
Or they were just going to give it as they said, but then they ended up charging us. Then they were saying
Mm.
to us like, "Oh, you've put all the wood on the wrong way round the Waney edge cladding. You have to pay for it to be turned around." We're like, "What?" So they were just like they just sort of went, they said, "Oh, you can't build wood stores. You're only allowed to use string to build like wood stores. You can't use nails or anything."
What?
Oh, there's some I could write you an entire list
Oh
of
my
like
God.
nonsense we have to go through, and so we got all the policies and all the sort of regulations in place and risk assessments and the safeguarding and all these things you need now to be able to work. There's probably 20 or 30 policies. You're probably similar in America, to be able to sort of operate out of this like shed, which was probably about 20 meters by 7 meters wide. It's not big at all. And we were basically running about 15 projects in the community from that as a base. But we also had a place on a farm that we rented cheaply to for our sort of permaculture demonstration
Mm.
site. So we had that as a sort of perennial nursery, and the idea was to propagate perennial plants, useful plants, to then take into the community to establish community orchards, usually under permaculture principles, and sort of like not freaking people out too much by using the word permaculture,
Mm-hmm.
because Forest Dean's quite a unique place. It's a very traditional,
Mm.
um, very sort of, I wouldn't say the God fearing. I'd say the more fearing of foreigners.
Mm.
So before they built bridges over, they was surrounded by a river basically in one of the highest tidal drops. It was on today actually. That it's called the Bore, and this one wave comes in and it can get up to 10 meters high because it's the second biggest tidal change
Wow.
in the world. The first is in Nova Scotia, I believe. But anyway, yeah. So that was on today. But basically, had this river around them, and I think it took about 70 or 80 years for the Romans to conquer them,
Mm.
and they were sort of the Sillaroos or Sillaries. Mainly around here and in the South Wales, which they were famed for being really fierce warriors, but also it was they were. I know a bit of this history, but basically the forester dean foresters, the people that lived in the forest, who were born in the forest, had certain rights because they helped a king when I think they dug underneath a castle and basically burnt out all um, the supports.
Wow.
Yeah, they think they put pigs in and then they set fire and then the intense burning brings the castle down. And the king was like, "Oh, thanks for helping us out. I'll give you special rights on the land because they turned it into the royal like hunting grounds, but then they allowed people to be free miners, for instance, where you have to work a year and a day in a mine, and then you could prospect your own mine, which is still live today.
Mm.
And then they have like commoners' rights as well to be able to graze animals, but also like to be able to coppice as well and
Mm.
do other sort of traditional practices. But that's kind of under threat now with, and this kind of ties in with rewilding as well, I feel, but with this kind of sort of eco-fascist conservation
Mm-hmm.
approach to land use, and that the plebs need to be in smart cities, and
Right.
basically we don't want to build resilience. We just want like people to be forever our slaves, really. So they're trying to push the Forest of Dean into a biosphere as well at the moment. So the biosphere will potentially throw any kind of forester's rights, ancient rights, they'll be thrown out the window because they won't fit in with the particular carbon narrative and
Do
the
you
natural
have,
assets.
so in that conflict of, in that area, are they calling that rewilding in terms of conservation? And do you have like conflict with the name of your organization and the conservation rewilding stuff? Like, does that generate, are people like, because we see this all the time where people think we're doing some conservation thing that we're not doing. And I'm
Yeah.
curious if because of that, because I feel like the UK is even more contentious in that way. Like the rewilding conservation that's going on in Britain in general, like that seems to be one of the biggest places where that's happening. So I imagine you have that conflict pretty regularly.
Well, I think it's a lot to do with there's a lack of education generally. Our education system's appalling, and we're sort of big advocates of like home education. You call it homeschooling in America,
Mm-hmm.
and we're really into sort of risky play, and we're into like real education and or sort of non-education, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel that a lot of people that have been sort of informed with this whole kind of carbon narrative and this sort of locking carbon in and ultimately creating natural assets where you're creating a value or a monetary value linked to that land,
Mm-hmm.
especially sort of wetlands. They get really sort of they sort of wet their pants and get really excited about wetlands because they sort of like they sort of store carbon. What is it like? Is it 80 times? I forget the stats
I
now.
don't know. Yeah.
It's huge, yeah. So there's a big contentious issue at the minute in the Forest of Dean. It's quite a good example. There's this canop ponds that they've got, and they basically it's dammed, and it's created this beautiful lake, and it's not natural, but the Forest of England, because they're just forever pleading poverty, even though they're a governmental organization, they're like, oh, it's structure, not structurally sound, and we're going to have to fix it. And our climate predictions, they're so sure on them. These climate predictions is it's going to wipe this dam out. No one lives like downstream as such. Quite far away. It'd be interesting to, it'd have to be quite huge, I think. But who knows what's going to happen? Nobody really does know what's going to
Mm-hmm.
happen. And I think that's what's
Yeah.
really interesting.
Yeah.
So I think with the Cannock Ponds thing, they've been like, oh, you just want to rewild it, don't you? And they're like, yeah, we want to bring that. And it's kind of tying in with this biosphere narrative to sort of lock in carbon and natural assets and, and then just sort of trade it on the stock market.
Mm-hmm.
And then corporations can, offset it and, greenwash tastic again.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel with the Cannock Ponds one is that while our conflict was going on with Forestry England, because their conflict was gaining momentum, they had like 40,000 people have signed a petition, and foresters like things as they are. They're really not into change. It's just like keep it as it is. So there's been a lot of conflict saying, "Oh, why don't you just pay to fix the dam?" And there's like there's so many habitats that have been established, but they just kind of want to just wipe it out and then be like, okay, but they make out that they listen to the public. They've got a new
Right.
policy now. It's the usual. We've got a new policy. Oh, we've got a new strategy. Oh, here we go. We have listened to you. You're like, well, have you? Because you just done the opposite of what you
Yeah.
said you would or wouldn't do. So it's just the same thing all over the world, isn't it? It's just
Mm-hmm.
like,
It really is.
yeah, yeah. So with this one, it's just sort of like, they're trying to consult with them, but the Canop Ponds, Safe Canop Ponds campaign were initially all like, Rewild Project, fuck off, kind of thing. We're like, no, we're on your side,
Yeah,
mate.
right.
And they talk a bit like this. Are you from the forest? I am. Or you don't want no Forest England telling me what to do. Or you want it to be all like it used to be. So they talk sort of a bit like that. That's a really shit accent. There's going to be like loads of foresters want to lynch me after this. But yeah, but basically, it's really interesting, sort of melting pot because they're known for rioting. When the Enclosures Act came in, and when the elites from London basically self-appointed and built, the land clearances, it's a bit like biospheres. It's going to be a form of land.
Yeah.
So when these land clearances come in, and it's already been happening, they're trying to do it with the Samis as well, aren't they? Under the guise of rewilding / biosphere. Well, when they brought in the Enclosures Act like 400 years ago, and a lot of foresters around here have still got a 400-year chip on their shoulder about what went on. So they're very skeptical about the authority, which is great because it's just like, well, yeah, they're not your friend, like they're sort of partly conscious of like, it is a bit of us and them, and the Forestry England are very cautious of like their reputation, and they like to have this shiny image, and that's partly what we've kind of come up against in the sense of that we're just a bit too radical for them, and we've not even been that outspoken, I feel, but it doesn't take a lot.
Yeah. So tell me about this current situation and what initiated it, because that to me is like another fascinating thing. Of yeah. So is the yeah. So just tell me about the current situation that you're in.
So our overlords, the Forestry England, or the people that we were like sort of tied in with this funding, the funding ended in March. And because it ended in March after this 5 year, in the back of my mind, I was like, they're gonna evict us. We've got no security. They promised us a lease for like 3-4 years, that we'd have a 10-year lease, but we were on a
Mm,
license for every year.
mm,
And their license was sometimes 3, 4, 5 months late from when it even supposed to. So we were kind of starting like illegally. We weren't even supposed to be running without a license, but they were so slow, and
mm-hmm,
they were just so like, they just didn't care.
mm-hmm,
And it just that um, arrogance of sort of, I don't know, despondentness of like the elites, who were, I don't know, it's funny. I'm dropping some names now, but I've got to be careful because we're actively we're occupying at the moment. But yeah, but so basically, and we haven't got any legal representation because we can't afford it, and a lot of people won't touch us with a barge pole, and they're basically, after that 5 year funding ended, I thought, oh, they're going to kick us out at some point. And so we've been operating for sort of nearly 7 years. And last March it ended, and then it came to Christmas, or sort of like, I hate that word, solstice, sort of like start of December. And um, they were like, oh, well, we were like pushing to sort of get our coppice license agreements, because we've been coppicing in the woods for like 6 years. And we're like, we need to get this license in place so we can go and operate like with the people that we work with in the community. And we basically work with a lot of marginalized people, a lot of people that don't get any sort of interaction. It's scary, the
mm-hmm,
isolation. And it's not even that rural here. It's only 42 square miles. So it's like 100 or so square kilometers, which is
mm-hmm.
tiny. And so with this shed that was in the center, people loved it. They'd come along. We'd pick them up in a minibus. Our project minibus was all graffitied by like the local teenage kids. We bring them to the center. We do handicrafts with them. We cook a meal with them, a warm meal. We share the food. We do some more skills, and then we take them back home. And then we take them to the land, and we do coppicing, or we take them to the land, and we basically sort out the like local community orchards that we've been part of, or the schools. And then we'd feed people and take them, and people could self-refer, or they got like signposted by social prescribers. And we basically was like, we were probably one of the best, we still are, but we were one of the best projects in Britain, really, for what we offered in the
Mm-hmm,
community. And you know what it's like, you don't really get paid, and it's just, and
mm-hmm.
I was living in a van with my partner and their kid and my kid sometimes in a little van, and we were basically living roadside. So we were roadside travelers. And last June, the government passed a new law because they wanted to ban protesting, and they wanted to wipe out the travelers. So the travelers bill went through in June, which meant that you can't even, well, it was used to be 40% of the land was private. Now 94% of all land in England is private. So it went from being a civil matter for trespassing to a criminal matter,
Mm,
which means that even if you park up for one night and somebody walks by, or somebody says, anyone can say, ring up the police and say, oh, I don't like those travelers being there, or that person being there. And if there's one or more vehicle, then you can basically, the police can tell you you need to move now, or we're impounding your vehicle, taking your vehicle off you, taking your home off you, and we're going to put you in jail for 3 months, and you're going to be fined up to £3,000. So we were basically for nearly 2 years living on roadside. And if we parked up on Forestry England land, or they say, oh, it's managed by the Forestry England, then there's certain bylaws. So we'd be chased around the Forestry England land saying you can't do that. And then when we had the meeting with like the new estates guy and the sort of all the the posh people at Forestry England, with our sort of doffing our caps to our Lord, they're like, oh, can we have a lease, please? Can we have a license? And they're like, oh, we've got a new our shared forest policy. We want to support community projects however we can. and it all kind of boiled back to like, it's only one meeting that I was in the meeting with like this head guy, Kevin Stannard, that no one particularly likes, and this is going to be interesting being recorded saying this. And he was in the meeting sprouting out about how supportive he was of our project, and I was like, actually, Kevin, you've not been supportive at all. And then basically, I was just like the elephant in the room, and I dropped the A bomb. And then they were just like, whoa, nobody ever says that. You can't criticize Forestry England. So, and then ever since they've been chasing around, the forestry, their land. And then we started parking on council land because we do contracts through like the government with Department of Education and delivering like holiday programs for free for local kids and stuff that don't often get a chance to do nature connection. Like in Gloucestershire, like in this county, there's about 40 projects for holiday programs, and there's probably 3 of them that are outdoors. And it's like, whoa, that's really depressing. And there's all this push as well about mental health now, since another controversial word, since the pandemic, there's all these teenagers that are like depressed, and there's all this like nonsense going on, and there's no support hardly at all. We've got schools here that are locking kids in classrooms, like detention, and it's just like, because they just play up, because the system doesn't fit at all. And this is why we set up this craft and land skill qualification for kids that are struggling at school or are totally sort of disengaged from it, and not even signed up. So basically, we were kind of, and we were also part of the other traveller movement in the Forest of Dean. There was a couple of camps, and then there was ones that were squatting land. But since the trespass bill, like everything, all the goalposts have changed now. So basically, we were on their radar big time, more and more. And then we had this meeting at the start of December about getting a lease so we can improve the building, basically offer better services, blah, blah, blah. And then we had a really good backing from a sort of ethical trust that was funding us. Everything was going really well. And then I took them out. I think it was like 16th of December, just before solstice. And it was like -10 for like a week following. And the week before, because I don't usually watch the news because it's just depressing. The week before, there was some kids up near Birmingham that 3 kids fell into the ice. It was thin ice. It was a deep lake. They were on their own, and they all drowned and died. And I didn't know about this. And and we do like nature connection. If there's like something there, we're going to sort of, we fully risk assess. We've got health and safety officers.
Totally.
Like, risk assessments are all great. Blah blah blah. Crack on. We've never had an incident. I've never had an incident in 15, 20 years of working with kids. We never had a serious incident. We've never even had any incident really. And so I was like, I took them to the ice because there's a pond next to the sheds, and it's about 2 foot deep because they kind of is an open cast mine. So they just scrape the top of it, and then it's basically regenerated into like this big wildlife habitat pond. And it's literally 2 foot deep pretty much all the way around. It's barely deeper than your knee. And so I took them on the ice, and I would explain to them like, this is how you test the ice.
Yeah.
We've tested the ice, we've checked it out. I've been in Sweden. We've took groups out to islands on freeze up and fall down. I've been in Canada. I've dealt with ice for years. I'm quite experienced. I've done like, wilderness mountaineering, sort of avalanche courses, all sorts of stuff, So I'm not like totally green to sort of being in that kind of environment. So we took the kids. The kids loved it. It was wicked. And then basically got back, and then we got one complaint from one of the kids' parents, who wasn't the parent that signed the kid up because they weren't together. And then instead of this parent, yeah, I know, it was me being naive, thinking everything will be fine. Instead of this parent going through our internal complaints procedure, which we spoke to him, and he was a friend of ours as well. He's kind of used to be an activist, sort of, political. He basically went straight to the council and dropped us in the shit. And then the council went to Forestry England as a governing body, and they're not a fucking governing body. They're just a fucking land managing landlord. And then literally they rang us like a few hours later. And then there was another complaint by a wildlife trust, is like a big charity that basically get everything off Forestry England and vice versa. And one of their volunteers, who's known for being very difficult and irate, kind of started screaming and shouting at our sort of OMED teenagers and traumatizing traumatizing them because there's a lot of sort of special educational needs we work with and stuff.
Mm.
And this guy, that was the incident really. And the kids weren't even on the ice then. They're just on the edge, and he just went mental, and he put a complaint in. So a total knee-jerk reaction, kind of usual kind of woke cancel culture that's all going on nowadays. You can't do anything. And then, and literally the shed is like 3-minute walk, 4-minute walk from where the pond is. And the burners go in, there's food, change of clothes. The worst thing, they would have got a wet feet, but this ice was nearly like 2 foot, you mean, you can usually operate, 15, 16 centimeters is pretty good. Anyway, so it was solid. Come back, and then before we know it, by the afternoon, they'd sent an email evicting us, and we need to be evicted, and we'd not had a complaint in 7 years. And basically, we have to have all our gear out of the shed within 7 days over Christmas and New Year. And we're like, what?
So the sheds that you refurbished that they were going to tear down.
Yeah, we built that we were going to tear down. And we're just like, whoa, okay, interesting. And then we went away for Christmas and New Year because it was just like, oh. And we just went out, went in the van sort of down to see some friends in the southwest. And then we came back for like the 3rd of January, which was the sort of first day of sort of back to work, because it was like a day after the bank holiday. And the contractors who I knew as well, because these like contractors that they use, who I knew from the community, were trying to change the locks on the sheds and effectively lock all our assets within the shed and bar us from our assets that are supposed to be, as a legal duty as a director of a CIC, those assets are community assets, and the community should be able to access them. So they already decided and done apparently a full investigation, and then their media releases were like, "Oh yeah, we've really tried to work with the Rewild Project, and we've tried to negotiate with them, but we just can't seem to find a resolution." And they totally stonewalled us. Like, we sent them 5 emails, like, "Okay, let's discuss this, blah, blah, blah." They're like, "No, you breached your license." That's all they said. "You breached your license. You shouldn't have gone out of the boundary of the fence of the sheds." I was like, "You guys have funded us for years. You know what we do. We've given you basically funding reports with photos of kids in that lake. I've got photos on social media with you tagged with kids on ice, even before this like incident happened." So all this kind of happened, and then we've put in like freedom of informations emails, and we've got some really interesting, because that's one of the few things you can do nowadays is request the information that's on you, and they have to give it to you. So basically, it was a bit of a witch hunt against me, and in essence, they've just lost like a really cool sort of community project to a certain degree. But we're not ones for sort of taking it lying down, and we changed venue to another place of this trust land, which are really sound in Colford, the next nearest town, and we basically delivered, because the people that come to us, they are kind of really like desperate to a certain degree. They've got nothing else really going on, or they have, and they want to feel part of something and part of a community like we all do. And we've got a really beautiful crew that come. And so basically FE then went on to our funders and told all them, and then our funders all basically backed out, or we'd lost funding. So we were just like, okay, let's just keep going anyway. So we found other ways. So we're having to sort of do jobs now, like we're doing like local sort of forestry jobs on sort of private jobs to fund the project still going. And we been negotiating with other sort of educational centres to partner up with and still to deliver, because people love what we do basically. And so we're basically sort of trying to get that sorted. But in the meantime, when they tried to come and change the locks, we said no, we're occupying it. And because we had a previous agreement with a previous license, and the place is non-residential, and we said, right, we're sleeping in the sheds because we are. We have then got squatters' rights as such, or occupational rights, and they can't get a thing called an interim possession order, IPO, because normally can get you out within 24 hours. And it was a very fine line between whether they're going to treat it criminal and come in with the police and arrest us for aggregated trespass. But the Forestry England, back to them wanting to be sort of like looking like, all the friendly I'm your friendly landlord kind of thing.
Mm,
In the public's eye, they don't want a shitstorm. They were like,
hmm.
whoa, okay. So I think the first 2 weeks they didn't even realize we were there, and then uh, 2 weeks later, the estates guy came. He's like, "What? This is very disappointing. It's very disappointing." I'm like, and he's like, "Oh, it must be very disappointing for you as well." Like, yes, mate. We've built this project for 7 years, and you lot are just basically trying to smash us, you know, into smithereens. So anyway, so we filmed it all. So because we've been documenting it all, so we were like, yeah, let's we could make a really cool grassroots activist film about the injustice of of the state
Hmm.
versus grassroots activism.
Hmm.
And so anyway, so we've been sort of following that. So then we got a letter from the Secretary of State of DEFRA, who's like well high up, saying that they're threatening us with court and we might have to pay all the court costs if we lose. So that was like 2 weeks after. So that was about a month ago. So we're still in occupation a month on, and we're still delivering workshops and working with local community. And we've got some work with the local homeless shelter, uh, basically sort of community-led design with them to work out what they want on their garden. We've just done all their tree work for them. So that's really good. We're doing some other tree work for local trust, the one that we're delivering from. So we're still going on, and I think it's I just thought they just thought that we are just going to lie down and take it, but yeah, so we're basically about to put a shout out and make it more public. So a lot of people just don't think we're going still, but we're about to release it publicly because we've kind of got to get this safeguarding case out of the way. So the sort of local council government safeguarding is like, oh, did you? They said, this is their words, Forestry England, you put children into intolerable risk, and we're just like, what? Intolerable risk? It's like, so you'd rather than sit at home on Wi-Fi and just you're just draining their souls because that's kind of what they want.
It's the
Or do you
thing.
want?
Yeah, I mean, it's a thing where they always have an excuse to kick people out, right? Like even and when it's going well or there's no reason to do it, they let, like you were saying, you sent them pictures and tag them with pictures of kids on the ice before, right? Um, but they're always going to have that up their sleeve whenever they want. They'll just invent a reason, right? That's what they do, and they have the power to do that, right? It makes me think, in our instance, we've had similar things like that, working with different government organizations and bureaucracies over here, where um, knife use, even just something like knives. Like there was a time where we were using knives with the city of Portland's, like we used to partner a lot with the educational department of the city of Portland, and they're awesome. I love everybody over there. Um, and they saw the knives that we were using with the kids, and they were like, oh, we'd love to buy some of those from you for our programs. And I was like, great. So I sold them a bunch of our knives. And then when we tried to go through the permitting process, to do a knife sharpening class in the parks, the permit department was like, those knives are not allowed in the park. I was like, literally, we sold the city these same knives. Like what are you talking about? And it's just like, with me, it's working through these types of bureaucracies. It's really like finding people that are allies that exist within them, but sometimes those allyships go away. People are constantly moving around in that. And so somebody goes away and the next person that comes in is like, what the hell are these people doing? And they maybe are not as radical as you or I or whatever. And so they'll find a reason to get rid of us, right? It's really disheartening. And I'm sorry that this is happening.
Yeah, it's pretty mad, really, because Forestry England, they've got a lot of power. I mean, they own about 4% of the entire landmass in the UK, sort of thing, which is a lot. I think the second biggest landowners or whatever. And I think there's, we've got the biggest sort of disparity of land ownership, and the big movement at the moment is the right to roam, which is part of the Land Justice Network, and Nick Hayes and wrote the Book of Trespass and the Trespass Handbook, and they do some really amazing work. And there's a place in Dartmoor in the southwest, which is the only place left. I think it's like probably like, I forget what it is now, 100 and so 100 or 200 acres, which is you're allowed to wild camp overnight. and some hedge funder has just bought it. I forgot his name now. Is it Davenport? And he's basically gone to the fucking I court. He's gone to the top, and he's then basically bought it and banned it, and it's become illegal now. And they had 3,000 people mobilize about a month ago on the land in protest. But what I feel is that it doesn't quite go far enough. There needs to be a right to dwell. There needs to be a right to work the land. There needs to be a right to be part of the landscape. Because we are a keystone species, we are part of the picture. And there's such a sort of in the Forest of Dean, there's probably, I think, is it 80,000 population, 100,000 population, and 42 square mile or whatever. Like, they want to put 7,000 houses somewhere, and then Green Party want to build a whole new town on the edge of town, on the floodplain probably, and they get the crappy building people who do 400, 500 houses which are not suitable. 10-year warranty. 10-year warranty. Yeah. Why do you buy a house with a 10-year warranty? And then it's like, we're in the forest, like we can build cabins. And we're building one at the permaculture demonstration site at Noxon Farm. We're building a 6-sided log cabin with a reciprocal roof, because I've built a few roundhouses as well before. So we're just showing that we can build like tiny homes and hobbit houses for less than £5,000. We can build them for very little. So this is our kind of springboard from what's happened. Is we're pushing our social environment education diverse, which is SEED program. And whether it's going to be a community land trust or the thing with trust, you get trustees, and trustees end up firing you or sacking you. And you're like, what? So, we're looking at maybe like a membership kind of format where you become a member, or some way where we have a community share offer where people, but the people that are living on the land, they've got the majority of the power, so they can't be sort of pushed around for the people's land. So we want to build tiny homes, ideally on keyline, using regen ag with alley cropping, incorporating animals and perennial. But also we want to set up, the hobbit houses. We kind of want the key points to be where the water is at the front of them. And then, we want it sort of passive solar as possible. But also we want to really incorporate a community health clinic, because the NHS is totally fucked. Like, the Tories have just sold it off to Virgin or whatever, to America. Like, it's gone. Our public health care is gone. And so basically, there's going to be very little filling that gap for the people, the majority of the people that are going to be suffering. So we also want to set up a venue space with like a cooperative kitchen, a bit like the Landworkers Alliance, Jyoti. I don't know if you've heard of Landworkers Alliance. Via Campestina, like one of the biggest unions of land workers, peasants in the world, like 200 million people. So we're part of that union as well, and we partner with them, which is a bit ironic really, because they get funding from DEFRA for changing with the farmers who, the sort of, the people up in the Oshalance of government and stuff. Anyway, but they're really down to earth, and they're a great organization. But they have like a cooperative kitchen where people can come and process like their food that they've grown or harvested, or foraged. So we want to basically create this sort of education center that also is incorporating a traveler's site of a transitional sense. So it's like a safe haven for people to park up, because there's stories now in London where people are having their homes taken off them on the side of the street. And I'm totally aware, and it breaks my heart about the state of like refugees and people fleeing violence or persecution. And there's some countries will just go and kill them or rape them, or it's just that every day. We don't, but it's kind of getting to that in Britain. The totalitarian system is in full swing. So we want to create these kind of networks, or this sort of mycorrhizal sort of formed of a sort of a new organic movement where we're skilling people up and being on the land, and we're working through stuff, and we want to incorporate sociocracy, and we want to incorporate or any decision making or governance that works. And we want to, and we fully, I've lived in community for long enough to realize that, conflict comes up, and conflict's a good thing too, and it can be looked as good. And we look at sort of conflict resolution models and how we can work through together to sort of find a resolution and, you know, have that circle consciousness again.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what we're kind of pushing for now. But because we've got like no money, we've got to be kind of creative in the sense that, you know, we're approaching like big landowners who want to see change as well themselves, partly because, you know, they don't really want their land rewilding and random crap trees being planted on them.
Totally.
That's not, you know, they're not even looking after the bloody trees.
Right.
It's just like, it's insane. And then they've got HS2, which is a train line that the government have just threw like 100 billion at, and it could cost another 100 billion for a vanity project to save like, I think it's 6 minutes, and it doesn't even go from Birmingham to London now. It's slightly short. And they've basically gone into, I think it's 120 or so ancient woodlands. We've got something like 3% of ancient woodlands left in Britain, and they're going through them like juggernaut, just plowing through, just demolishing them. And the community are like, whoa, what's going on? But they're just doing it. It's just going through. So there's protests with that as well. You know, there's still a first movement in Britain. There's still people sort of fighting these people. You know, and it's just, that's the thing. It's just, we're always fighting, you know, and it's just trying to find a solution and an alternative rather than, you know, it's always going to be a fight, isn't it? I feel it's because, you know, we've got the, I don't know, we've got the sort of it's almost like, you know, colonialism has done so much damage, and we want to become indigenous again. We want to become native. We want to have, like, you know, we want to be able to create our own culture because we've lost our culture in Britain. And that's what's lush about Ireland, you know. And Lucy, who you podcasted with, she's amazing. And like, it's so cool that Ireland's still got a culture, you know, and Wales has still got a culture. England, it's almost like we've got to reinvent it, which would be fun, you know. Let's have some fun doing it because people get so serious with all this shit. And like, you know, humor is such a massive part of being indigenous. It's just like, let's try and, you know, let's have some fun in the meantime. So I mean, that's one of the last things we've got left in Britain is humor, because some of the funny shit that's been coming out since this entire nonsense of 10 years of austerity. And now we've got, like, you know, then we had bloody Brexit, and then we had fucking pandemic, then we had like nuclear war about to happen with Ukraine. And I said, oh, I've been joking for like the last year or so. I was like, well, the next is going to be alien invasion. And now it's got this UF shit kicking off. Right. And it's just like, oh my word, how much more can you amp up the fear? But yeah, there's been a lot of good comedy coming out of all that. But you know, Britain is famous for its, you know, comedy and for being revolting people. You know, Britain's famous for like revolting and putting the heads on pikes. You know what I mean? Like, why is that not still a sport? You know, like, it used to be a thing.
I mean, you know, the more systems become authoritarian, the more people are going to resist. You know, in theory, I think that there's a big I think that that's going to be our challenge in the next 50 years is the collapse, you know, causing societies to become more authoritarian to maintain their control as resources become more scarce, you know, and there's competing forces around the world doing that. And then people like us are just going to be working on the sidelines until the thing comes apart. And then, you know, we're creating the society that will persist through the collapse of whatever states exist today. At least that's my, you know, framework around doing it is, you know, I think that the what we're doing is sort of the innate thing that makes people, and whether the state, you know, allows it or not, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. Just like a dandelion is going to continue to grow up through the sidewalk, you know, a tree's roots are going to continue to destroy the concrete that get poured on it. And it takes a while because the concrete's a powerful force that's been in, you know, thrust upon a tree's roots, but a tree's going to be stronger because it's slower growing. And, you know, I think that's essentially what our kinds of rewilding projects are doing, are these sort of long-term root projects that just keep coming back. You know, we get cut down, we keep coming back, we get cut down, we keep coming back. Because what we do is the innate core of humanity. And everything else is just, you know, some fucked up projection that's only been allowed to us because of the material reality of the last 10,000 years, you know, of agriculture.
And compliance, you know, and I think that's as well, you know, there's 50%, of the land in Britain is controlled by 1%. At least
Yeah.
in
Right.
America, you've still got, in America, you've still got some like, right to be somewhere for 2 weeks and then you can move on again, can't
That's
you?
true. That's
So,
true.
in Britain, like, well, Scotland's got the right to roam. They're trying to push it for England. But like I said, back to right to dwell. And people, with all this sort of cost of living crisis, it's just insane. Like, they're just creating more and more scarcity and people are getting more and more fearful. But I think, if we did start taking land en masse, taking that, this, I mean, the three kind of big pushers of rewilding in Britain are like, National Trust don't really want to call it rewilding, but it's what they're doing because they're a bit too posh to say it's rewilding. And then, the church own a lot of land. The Duchy of Cornwall, our new king, they, three of them they own a third of all of England, just those three. It's just, you just got these
absurd.
massive estates that they've got. It's just, it boggles my mind.
Yeah.
There's something like, there's all these books, there's Simon Fairley's really good. He wrote like, Can Britain Feed Itself kind of thing. And he's done some really good books on meat, and he's done some really good books on the low impact planning books. And it's so difficult to do anything on land unless you're rich in Britain.
Yeah.
And it's just, so that's what I mean. I think we need to start actually, taking it upon ourselves, getting organized, and then taking it. And I think this is what the springboard is from the Rewild Project into seed. But there's still going to be things going on with the Rewild Project because that's kind of like our educational arm. But we are looking at this the squatting laws. Since 2012, they made squatting illegal. There's ways around it, so we're trying to sort of like find our ways around it and test these laws and see how far we can push it. And we work with the irony is that we work with the police as well. The police refer youngsters to us that they can't do anything with, and they love what we do because they can't do what we do. So in a way, it's sort of like we'll see if it comes to a head. The ideal is that a bit like in Portugal when the revolution happened. What was it in 74? Was it 82? Well, the flower in the end of the gun barrel that Banks kind of did as a graffiti picture, and Portugal had quite a small population, a bit like Ireland, really, when the Rossport Shell thing happened and they wanted to put the big oil refinery on the coast of Ireland. Like the Guardia, their police, they couldn't do anything because they're all family. Everyone knows everyone. And in Portugal, everyone knew everyone. Why would you shoot your family? So, basically, the guns got laid down and people were like, right, let's sort this shit out, Sri Lanka, was it last year or the year before? They just went into parliament, the people, and dragged out the politicians and just beat the shit out of them in the street because they were like, we're not having this anymore. Like, what? Why is this happening? So I think it's going to get to a point like that, and I'm surprised there weren't riots in Britain this winter. And I think it's getting to a point. This summer is going to be really interesting because it's getting really squeezed now, and they're really pushing for these 15-minute cities. Sort of the World Economic Forum, the Chinese sort of social crediting thing. They're trialing them, and I think there's about 120 councils have signed up for them in Britain. So that'd be interesting. I'm all for cutting car use. I'm all for like, just natural ways of being, but to sort of control people's time and where they can move and when they can't move in these sort of carbon prisons,
right?
It's going to be interesting. What happens?
That is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you have any questions for me?
Well, we were going to talk about sociocracy, and I think our lesson from sociocracy is we in the last sort of 15 months we went from like 4 or 5 staff or crew to about 25, but we basically employed lots of people with like interviews and recruitment and all that, because before I just used to get mates in to help out, who were like activists or people I knew trusted over the years. So we ended up getting all these sort of people in, and they basically didn't live up to what they said in their agreements, and everything just seemed really challenging. And we were really naive to try and think we could like create a system of sociocracy within an organization from scratch. So people kind of like, people are used to hierarchy. People quite like being told what to do. And there's like, there's way of hiding in that. And sociocracy, you can't really hide. And I think one of your early questions was, oh, is it not just old school anarchist values of decision making? I was like, yeah, totally. But it's quite nice to sort of try and package that and make it more accessible, without using the word anarchy, and freaking people out. So the sociocracy stuff's really interesting. And I've come from a background of activism in Britain where consensus decision making was like the thing. And I've seen it used really badly more than I've seen it used really well. So it's quite refreshing to have something new to work from. And yeah, well, the questions I had for you, I think it was when do you think the inevitable collapse will be, and where do you think you're going to be? And I can't remember what the other one was.
Yeah, in terms of collapse, I think, it's like when I was 16 and I read Ishmael, I thought, oh my God, civilization is going to collapse next year. It's been almost 25 years. It'll be 25 years next year. So in retrospect, it's hard. Collapse isn't necessarily a thing that happens overnight. It's not a singular event, right? I consider what we're in. I prefer Joseph Tainter's definition of collapse, which is essentially like a very brief amount of time and a population decline that happens within that brief amount of time. So a 10-year period, for example, with a population decline, that's a collapse. We're talking about a famine, a disease, warfare, right? Those three things are the things that can decrease populations really rapidly in a very short amount of time. Will those things happen? Probably, on a bigger level, like, the COVID-19 pandemic, the percentage of deaths was very, very low in comparison to previous global pandemics. I mean, if you think about the Black Plague, that was nearly 50% of the population. That's huge, right? In 4 years, 50% of the population, right? So, when we think about that's a collapse, like the pandemic that we had was minor in comparison. So it's not, when I think about what I think of we're in is a decline. And then there are moments of collapse, like, what's going on in a particular city. If a city's being bombed or an earthquake happens or whatever, that's going to catalyze further collapse of society, that's going to disrupt supply lines and those kinds of things that are going to create famine or disease or more warfare in terms of resource competition. Those are going to be the things that really push a collapse. But I don't think there will ever be an event that can be pinned as the collapse of civilization, especially because if we think about the way that civilizations are structured now, there's civilization is a global network. And so as those networks get disconnected from one another, there's still going to be localized networks of civilization, of what we call civilization. And so while one area might collapse, then other areas might not in any particular event that might happen that is a more of a collapse type event. I have no idea what is in store. I had this my mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, years ago, and the doctor pulled me and my siblings out into the hallway from the room that she was in at the hospital, and he's like, I want to be totally blunt with you right now. Your mom was up here and now she's down here. She's never going to be up here again. She might come back up here, halfway or even closer to here, but she's never going to be what she was, right? And it's just going to look like that for the rest of her life, up and down, up and down, up and down, never fully going back up to where she was at any moment, right? It's always going to be a slight decline. And I think that's like the perfect picture or, physical description of a declining and collapsing society. So you have if you were to graph the Roman Empire, you would see a decline over 100 years, or even 200 years. And in the collapse of complex societies, Joseph Tainter uses the Roman Empire as one of his 3 examples because it's so well documented. And one of the things that you see is, it's funny reading about this shit that was going on 2,000 years ago that is totally reflective of today, like in the United States, for example, the inflation rates. Like he goes through and talks about the inflation of Roman coins over the period of 200 years. And what happened was in the first 80 years of the Roman Empire, the conquest, the warfare, all of that generated the majority of wealth that Rome had. And then they just basically, subsisted off that wealth for another couple hundred years because of how much they had gained in terms of their colonization efforts. But at some point, the administration has to do more administration. It has to do, as society grows, as there's nowhere left to expand to, there's nobody left to enslave, it eventually reaches a point of diminishing returns and it starts to decline. And then if there's an event that happens, the decline happens even swifter, right? And so it's funny, like, the emperors of Rome, each one ruled for a shorter amount of time than the one before them. And so whereas, the first Roman emperors or whatever, they were 30, 40, 50 years or whatever they were ruling. And eventually by the end of the time, there was a new one every year, because it's hard to even know who was actually emperor, because there was just constant revolution, right? Every few years. And the coins were, the inflation was ridiculous. Like, initially they were all gold coins, and by the end of it they were paying everybody in like silver that had been mixed with nickel and like all of these things, and they were paying them in like the hundreds of thousands. And eventually, like, farmland became so expensive to own and use that people just stopped being farmers and became barbarians or whatever, right? Because it made more sense. And so Rome's entire structure was based on grain taxation, but that became too expensive for farmers. And so then all of a sudden, Rome had no more farmland and the whole thing was over, right? And then it transitioned, obviously the empire of Rome in and of itself collapsed, but the colonial nature of it decentralized and became a lot of the countries that exist today in Europe, or, slowly over time. But and America is an extension of all of that. So, historians argue over like what year did Rome collapse, but there's no way to actually state it, right? There's no event that led to collapse specifically. It's a series of events over a long period of time that just relates back to the diminishing of return. So how much energy does civilization have to continue? I mean, not a lot, right? Like, we're at peak oil extraction. We're there. I mean, there might be some technologies that get more efficient at processing it, that'll extend it a little bit, but we're at essentially the point of diminishing returns. So the inflation that's happening, that's going on right now, um, at some point, and there are particular places that are opening up for more rewilding, or to alternative lifestyles, that even though they're drawn around state lines, like, for example, the city of Detroit, right? Like, in Michigan, in the United States, there's a city that's basically been and cities around it that have been collapsed for a long time. Like, the auto industry was a boom. They moved everything to Mexico, and NAFTA and these other fair trade or free trade things happened. All these people lost their jobs. You could just go to like Flint, Michigan, and just live in a house. There's just empty houses. You could just go live in them, right? There's entire neighborhoods that are rewilded in the like going back to nature sense, where there's no people living there and they're overgrown and all of that stuff. Like, those are areas that have opened up. And so the more, that resources are extraction is happening, the more we're going to see like civilization specifically, shrinking to be around the resources that it deems valuable. And the places that it deems invaluable are the places where there's going to be, more free, the ability for people to create their own cultures and societies. And of course, if they get too big and are noticed by the state, they'll get destroyed. So there's going to be an interesting thing there, in terms of like, where are the transition points? And you asked me where I will be. I'll be here in Portland. I'm gonna die here. My ancestors are buried here. All my recent ancestors are buried here. So I'm gonna die here, and I'm gonna go out fighting, whatever that might look like. But in the meantime, I'm gonna be trying to do essentially social forestry work and forest gardens and whatever, all of the types of management in the urban context as much as possible, to abate any kind of starvation that might happen during a famine, any of that kind of stuff. I think that's sort of one of the roles of rewilding in urban contexts, is to make the spaces here as abundant with food for people as possible, because of the density of population and the potential for mass starvation.
Mm.
So that to
That's
me is,
interesting. Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because in the Forest of Dean, it's quite a unique place in the sense that we've got wild boar here, and then before COVID, I think we had like nearly the forestry were like, oh no, we've only got 400 or so, and people were like, no, there's way more than 400. We did like the radar thing, and then they were like, oh, there's about 2,000. And they're like,
Oh,
oh yeah, yeah. So it's like, and then there must be about 1,000, 2,000 deer as well. So all this obviously is, it's hilarious that they try and plant trees at all because the deer are eating them from the top, the rabbit are eating them from the bottom,
yeah.
and, the squirrels are just finishing them off in the middle. So yeah, and they don't do any sort of controlling of squirrels. They don't do any control of rabbits, but they control the boar and the deer, and they've now got them down to less than 200. They've almost wiped the boar out, and those boars shot by Forestry England rangers because you're not allowed to hunt, and then they sell it off to the highest bidder, so it gets tendered for the contract, and most of it goes to the southeast, like miles away, and then it ends up in London, and it's just like and
In
these
like a
people,
fancy restaurant or something,
yeah,
right?
exactly. These people
It's
queuing
fucking
up in food
insane.
banks for like tinned peas and tinned beans if they're lucky, and pasta, and there's all this like abundance of food. We've talked about setting up this like cooperative kitchen where we can then put a tender in to the Forestry England to keep it local. So like, let us have it.
Yeah,
We'll
right.
process it, and they only
Yeah.
take the muscle meat. The usual thing: take the muscle meat, throw everything else away. So we want to be able to really build on sort of food sovereignty. And I think the big thing is water sovereignty as well. People even
Hmm.
talk about it. And
Yeah.
we've got a project called Springs and Wells of the Forest of Dean, and we cleaned out a local well that's been like really ancient, and people go in there like cold immersion, and it's just really special, magical place, and it not been touched for like 10, 15 years and just full of crap. So we cleaned out over 2 days with the local community, and we're fixing up the spring around the corner, and we made a map of like the main springs and wells of the Forest of Dean, and basically raising awareness that like we need to drink wild water.
Yeah.
It's bloody tap water. So
Yeah.
that's really positive as well. But and I think that's what it boils back to as what of it, isn't it? Is that where are the resources that we can actually use or create or enhance locally? And I think that's what's about. That's resilience,
Hmm.
raising that awareness. And like people always say that, oh, nature's only going to be looked after until people like fall in love with it, and they're only going to fall in love with it by being exposed to it.
Yeah.
And it's just a bit like, well, come on, let's and this is the real sad thing about the Forestry England approach, is that, oh, the forest is just for dog walkers and mountain bikers, and that's basically it. But it's just but I do love what you guys do as well, with the Rewild Portland, and the it's a definite inspiration. I think we partly set up the Rewild Project partly of like watching what you were originally doing like 7 years ago, because you've been at it for quite a while now,
Yeah.
haven't
Yeah.
you?
Over 12 years now. Yeah.
Yeah, which is great. So we are totally inspired by that, and that's what we
I'm
do. And
definitely inspired by what you're doing as well. I get FOMO looking at your forestry projects because we don't have a lot of access to land. We're just starting to get more now. And I'm definitely looking at what y'all are doing for the kinds of
cool.
stuff that we're doing over here now that we've had more access to land too. Yeah.
Yeah, sweet. And that's the key, isn't it? Is the access to land bit. And I think
Yeah.
hopefully people will be changing for like, because I think there's been something like since I think 2021, the average price of land rose 87% in Britain.
Yeah.
It's just
It's
off the
it's
scale.
not that much here, but it's not, yeah, it's grown a lot here as well. Like when we were first started, looking at maybe buying land, if just thinking about planning for the future, there were some sites that I was like, this would be a really great site. And I earmarked it, and I think at the time it was like $400,000 or something. And then when we had actually maybe we're working on saving enough for a down payment, by the time we were even ready to start saving for a down payment, the property had sold for like $1 million. So it doubled in like a couple of years, and now it's gone even more and more and more. It's a exponential in that sense. And so, yeah, there's probably no way we'll ever be able to actually purchase at this point, unless we get philanthropists who want to donate
Exactly.
to us,
Yeah.
that's the only way. And the other way is to meet people who currently own land who want to have us out there, right? Because they understand the value of the kinds of things that we do, the kinds of forestry that we do, and they need that kind of maintenance. So that's the relationships that we're building right now, and hoping that at some point, there will be a philanthropist who wants to donate to Rewild Portland to get us land on a bigger scale.
I say
Yeah.
you got to go to a few more posh dinners and hang out with people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They're
it's
out
definitely,
there. They're out
yeah,
there.
for
It's a
sure.
matter of finding them. I think there's lots of people who have money who want to invest it in stuff like this,
Well, they get hijacked, they get hijacked by, the big boys, don't they?
Totally. Yes.
Yeah, it's just
Yeah.
come join our greenwash campaign and it's
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so yeah. But anyway, it is what it is, and it ain't
Yep.
what it
Do you
ain't.
have any last things you want to say? Is there a link people can support the Rewild Project and uh the encampment or anything that's going on right now?
Yeah, I guess. Well, we're on Insta's Rewild Project, and sort of Facebook's the Rewild Project, and we on our website we've got sort of ways of becoming a member if you want to support us. We didn't go down the Patreon route, but similar kind of thing. And if you're like wanting to come and visit or actually just get involved, we love people getting involved. Just be part of the movement, really, and yeah, just spread the word, really. And yeah, yeah, it's just getting hard because of the sort of cost of living and such. Is that our workshops aren't selling as well as they used to, and in a way, we're trying to look at this as positive of all this sort of uh, this conflict that we're having in dispute is that it's raising our profile, really. It is putting us out there more and more. We even got into the national tabloids. I
Nice.
didn't. No, but yeah, it's been quite a balanced sort of argument as well with it, really. And I can see why people are saying, you should just tell children no. It's a bit like the drugs thing. Just say no to them. It's just like, well, surely it's better just to educate them.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway, it's Britain. It's quite a woke world in Britain, and
Hmm.
cancel culture is massive here.
Hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, but apart from that, yeah, just get in touch and follow what we do. We've been a bit slack on the social media stuff. We're kind of keeping our heads down at the moment, but by the time this rolls like out in the world in the ether, things might have took some interesting
Yeah.
development.
We'll see. Thank you so much for coming on the Rewilding podcast. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, total. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rewilding podcast. Check out the show notes to connect with my guests and for a list of resources that we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you or made you think more deeply or gave you some new tools to use, make sure to subscribe and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. Thank you very much.